The Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. This morning we had intended, of course, to hear from the Kielburgers, but they've declined their earlier acceptance of the invitation. And so I know that already I'm getting indication from committee members that would like to speak to that specifically. And so I will turn immediately to Mr. Barrett first. Mr. Barrett, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Chair. And good morning. I had put a motion on notice with the committee last week following the letter that we received from the lawyer representing Mark and Craig Kielburger. And so I'll get to the text of that motion in just a moment. But I do think it's important to note the seriousness of what was contained in that letter. And
point of order, Chair.
Ms. Shanahan.
Yeah, is it normal that we don't see Mr. Barrett on screen?
It would be good to see Mr. Barrett. So we'll ask our technical crew to see if that is possible.
You don't need to. I'm happy to see and be seen.
We'll give them a minute here. As soon as we see him pop up on the screen, we'll turn the floor back to him. There we go. Okay, Mr. Barrett.
Oh, thanks.
The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Chair. So the seriousness of the contents of the letter from the lawyers representing Mark and Craig Kielburger is it has to be addressed, and it is the reason that I've put forward, or I put a motion on notice that I will read in just a moment for the committee's consideration. And the committee went to great lengths. Specifically, our committee clerk worked over several months to secure an appearance by the proposed witnesses, Mark and Craig Kielburger, and we bent and worked with their schedule and had a scheduled date, and that date no longer worked for them, and the committee found a new date that would work, and then in the days leading up to that meeting, we received this letter from the Kielburgers' lawyer, and it said that they wouldn't appear at this committee. And not only would they not appear in response to the invitation, they also stated they would not appear if a summons were issued for them. That's incredibly serious. Our committee and Canada's Parliament has the right to request witnesses appear, and we also have the right to issue a summons. And for individuals to openly dismiss the invitations and to preemptively say that they will not respond to a summons really is flouting the legitimacy and the authority of Canada's Parliament. It was I think shocking, the letter from their legal counsel, and it was highly inappropriate. I think that these two gentlemen, both recipients of the Order of Canada, they often wear their pins on their lapel, for them to demonstrate to Canadians, to all of the school children, for whom they've appeared at their schools and invited them to events with their organization, to then say, you know, what we're doing is important, but what Canada's democratically elected members are doing is not, is absolutely the wrong message to send. So I'm going to be moving a motion now that this committee do issue summons for both of these individuals. That pursuant to Standing Order 108-1A and further to the motions adopted by the committee on January 29 and February 19, 2021, in light of Craig and Mark Kielburger's refusals to attend the committee on March 8, 2021, summonses do issue to Craig and Mark Kielburger to appear before the committee for at least 3 hours at a date and time determined by the chair, but no later than 1 week following the adoption of this motion, provided that if either or both of them fail to appear after being served with the summons, or refuses or evades service of the summons, the chair shall be instructed to present a report to the House forthwith, setting out the relevant facts. Chair, that motion was put on notice last week. It's available in both official languages, and I, of course, will be supporting this motion and would encourage all of my colleagues on committee to do the same. Thank you.
I find that motion is in order. I've got 3 people on the speaking list. We'll go to Mr. Angus first, followed by Ms. Shanahan, followed by Dr. Carey. Mr. Angus, we'll turn to you.
Well, thank you, Chair. First off, I would like to wish Happy International Women's Day to all the incredible women parliamentarians in our institution and the incredible women everywhere who do so much incredible work for our building a better society. La deuxième chose, je suis très...
The second thing I want to say is that I'm very concerned by the actions of the Kielburger brothers. Considering the challenge faced by the committee, so I'll be supporting my colleague's motion. It's unacceptable for the Kielburger brothers to refuse explaining themselves. They have an obligation to appear before the committee to explain their role in the student grant scandal. And it's also an opportunity for the Kielburger brothers to explain their role in the allegations of manipulation of international donors. It is essential for the Kielburgers to respect the rights of Parliament to request their testimony to launch investigations in the use of government funds.
Just to say, how did we get here? And to put this in a very clear picture so we understand, because we are dealing with a very disturbing and unprecedented situation with the refusal to appear and the threat to defy a summons. Today should have been the last day of witness testimony of our study into the $912 million in taxpayers' money that would have been given to the Kielburger Group. This study began 8 months ago, and it has been subject to, I would say, an unprecedented level of interference and interruption. Last summer, we were on the eve of getting key documents in the scandal when the Prime Minister shut down Parliament because of the corrosive effects of the revelations that were coming forward from both the Finance and Ethics Committee investigations. When Parliament reconvened, our committee was blocked by filibustering on the government side for the equivalent of 20 straight meetings. So that meant we were well into November before this committee could pick up where it had left off in the summer. In the end, all parties came together and agreed that we needed to finalize this report per our obligation to Parliament. And we agreed on a final set of meetings, and that would include the testimony from the Kielburger brothers and other key representatives of the WE organization. But instead of us being able to finalize this report, the Kielburger brothers have announced they are refusing to appear today. Not only that, but through their lawyers, they have stated that leadership of WE will also defy Parliament. I'm not sure if they're including some of their staff in that refusal. But even more extraordinary is their claim that they will defy a legal summons if it's issued. This is a direct challenge to the powers of Parliament to investigate spending and issues of insider access that were well within the purview of our committee. And it is well within the constitutional privileges that we have as democratically elected members representing the people of Canada. So what happened in the last 2 weeks to cause the Kielburger brothers to take such a reckless course of action? Well, a little over a week ago, we heard extraordinary testimony from a major WE donor who made allegations of donor manipulation. Mr. Reid Cowan is an Emmy award-winning journalist, and he is a member of WE Charities Advisory Board. And following his very emotional and powerful testimony to our committee, he stated the need for an IRS, CRA, and police investigation into how this group raises funds. Reid Cowan has a right to get answers from the Kielburgers, and those answers should have been presented to our committee today. Would the Kielburgers have faced hard questions? Certainly. But when you are in the business of raising charitable funds, trust and accountability is sacrosanct. And so you show up. and you answer the tough questions, because hard questions on fundraising are also fair questions. But Reed Cowan wasn't the only problem facing the Kielburgers last week. Bloomberg released a damning article entitled, quote, "We Charities' Actions Leave a Trail of Enraged and Grieving Donors." The article lays out disturbing allegations of donor manipulation, where the emotional ties of potential donors were played on to get major fundraising initiatives undertaking. And Bloomberg states that, quote, "We donors include grieving parents, school kids, corporate sponsors, wealthy foundations, and widows such as 89-year-old Joyce Jennison." And they say, Joyce Jennison is left wondering why that little schoolhouse with the green roof in the photo has been dedicated to another grieving family. Where is her husband Don's plaque? Because it's more than a plaque to her. It's his tombstone. Joyce Jennison has a right to hear testimony today, but instead the Kielburgers have gone to ground. And then last night, CBC followed up with a disturbing expose of a similar pattern of donor manipulation in supporting a water project in Kenya. And Mr. Chair, when I watched that documentary, I was really deeply moved by the incredible volunteerism that we see in our country, in places like Whistler and Mount Forest, where so many people came together to make a difference. And they were inspired by the promises of the Kielburger brothers about how their money was being spent. It made me think of my own two daughters, who when they were young read Craig Kielburger's autobiography. I drove them hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to Free the Children events. They began raising funds for a school in Nicaragua because they believed. And we need to reassure people that their goodwill efforts matter, that their time and their fundraising is respected. Because when you are in the business of raising funds, you are in the business of raising hope. And all those people who believed and hoped they were making a difference have a right to hear the Kielburger brothers explain to themselves. And today was an opportunity for Craig and Mark Kielburger to take the hard questions and explain what is going on in their organization. But having to put those explanations on the record in televised hearings appears too much for them. So they've gone to ground. And they've stated through their lawyer that they will defy any legal summons to what they claim is an attempt by a, quote, partisan committee to carry on its own substitute investigation. There is no substitute investigation. There is the parliamentary committee that has been assigned to this since last summer. It is the Ethics Committee investigation, and we are being blocked right now by their refusal to testify. So, fair question. What do the issues of grieving and angry donors have to do with the report of this committee? Well, when we look at the $912 million that was being set aside for the Kielburger organization, it comes down to three questions. One, was proper due diligence done on the claims made by the Kielburger brothers to deliver a very complex program involving a staggering amount of money in a very short period of time? Two, did the Kielburgers get the inside track because of their close relationship to the Liberal government and the key ministers on the file, for whom the Kielburgers had curated strong personal connections? Did this inside track involve illegal lobbying? And I would have loved to have had Craig given the opportunity to explain how he worked those corridors of power and how he did follow the rules, if he did indeed. And the third question is, what exactly is this group and how do they operate? We have We Charity, we have Me to We have the We Foundation, we have a multiplicity of side companies, real estate holdings, and shell companies, and bureaucrats took it for granted, as I think we all would have, that they were dealing with We Charity. But in the end, the Canadian people were asked to sign over $540 million in that initial funding agreement to a shell company that was set up to manage We's immense real estate holdings. A shell company. How is that possible? Is it because the Kielburgers' reputation was seemingly so stellar that no hard questions were asked? And after 8 months of investigation by this committee, I can say that I'm sure every single member of this committee is no further ahead in knowing how the money flows, or even how many corporate entities the Kielburger brothers control. And we would have asked those questions today, but they are no show. Now, the Kielburgers are portraying themselves in the media as politically naive, that they were somehow the victim of partisan mugging. But the facts do not back this up. If you watch the meteoric rise of the Kielburger brothers, you realize they carefully cultivated their political friends. They built strong relationships across North America. They knew how to work the Davos crowd. And the Kielburger brothers worked very closely with Justin Trudeau when he was running for leader. They helped create his image as the aspiring stadium hero for young people. That's Craig. No, sorry. They gave him a stage and helped build his brand, even to the point of doing promotional videos for him. When Justin Trudeau became Prime Minister, the Kielburger brothers were essentially adopted as goodwill ambassadors for Canada. They led the Canada 150 celebrations. They were chosen to represent Canada at the UN with a huge stadium-type show that featured the Prime Minister and his wife. So they cannot now defy our democratic institutions because they say it's partisan and it no longer works for them. We learned how carefully they cultivated their relationships with Finance Minister Bill Morneau. They hired his daughter. They sent their volunteers to work his events. They paid $41,000 for him and his family to travel the world. No wonder that Morneau's staff called the relationship between Bill Morneau and the Kielburgers as, quote, besties. And this relationship was so solid that on April 10th, 2020, Craig Kielburger bypassed all staff in the finance office and wrote directly to Bill Morneau. Hey, Bill, I hope this finds you, Nancy, Henry, Claire, Edward, and Grace enjoying some well-deserved downtime. And that message, Craig was asking for Bill Morneau to sign off on $12 million grant. And within a mere 11 days, the finance minister gave a verbal sign-off on this funding. And at no point was Craig Kielburger registered to lobby. His director of government relations, Sophia Marquez, who was also not registered to lobby, said to our committee that she was not involved at all in the negotiations of this $12 million proposal. This was handled by Craig Kielburger. A $12 million side deal negotiated by two besties. This is not how funding projects are supposed to be handled in Canada. And Craig Kielburger could have been here today to explain how that went down, but he's not. And that April 10th outreach by Craig Kielburger led to the meeting with Minister Chagger on April 17th, where, according to both Marquez and Kielburger in their subsequent emails, Minister Chagger gave them the heads up on this separate service stream proposal that became the $900 million grant. And I got to point out here that both Minister Chagger and Minister Qualtrough, whose ministries oversaw this proposal, had been featured on stage at the We Day rallies. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But the issue here is that when tough questions should have been asked, nobody was asking them. Because despite claims that the government was looking at other options, the documents are clear. The Kielburger Group had the inside track from the get-go. There was no other group spoken to, or no other organization offered the chance to bid. So it doesn't cut it today for the Kielburgers to have exploited this extraordinary level of insider access with the corridors of power and then to refuse to answer questions about how they use these relationships to their advantage. So now let's just connect the dots in my final segment here between the DonorGate scandal that's emerged in the media and the summer student grant scandal. One of the deeply disturbing allegations in the Bloomberg article is the fact that multiple members of the WE staff joked about what they called Kiel math. Quote, Bloomberg spoke to nearly 24 former staffers whose employment spanned 2 decades across the world. They described a corporate culture they said played fast and loose with the facts. Kiel math was how the staff referred to the way we quantified its impacts. So why does that matter? Because we see all through the Kielburger documents to the Canadian government's claims that when you look at them closely, simply don't add up. Let's take the fact that the Kielburgers initially claimed they could take 16,000 students themselves. This is an organization that had just laid off hundreds. And when Finance Minister Michelle Kovacevic wrote that they were not only going to take 16,000, they were ready to take 20,000 students. Well, then the Kielburgers toned it down and said they could handle 10,000. Any of those numbers is an extraordinary amount. If anyone out there who's done any kind of work in trying to run programs to suddenly announce that over a month you're going to take 20,000, 16,000, 10,000, maybe you could. Maybe you couldn't. But you would have thought that tough questions would have been asked to say, okay, exactly how is this going to go down? So when they said that they toned it down to 10,000, they said, well, here's the thing. We've got a deal with Imagine Canada to get another 10,000 students placed. That was stated on April 30th by Craig Kielburger. It was updated in their claim of partnership on May 4th. And Minister Chagger did not question these claims. In fact, she brought their statement word for word into her cabinet briefing. So it was Kielburger's spin and Kiel math that was being used to sell cabinet on the idea. This Kielburger language was repeated by ESDC to reassure the Treasury Board when they began to ask how was this going to go down. And this is significant because the Imagine Canada partnership reassured department officials that this project was doable. But there was no agreement with Imagine Canada, and neither Chagger nor Morneau's office bothered to check. Imagine Canada even felt the need to come forward to say that they had no partnership on this. And yet in late June, this supposed partnership was still being promoted in Minister Bill Morneau's notes. So what does that tell us? That basic due diligence wasn't done. That it was the Kielburger brothers and Kiel math that was trusted from the get-go. So if the Kielburger brothers had shown up today, we could have asked them those hard questions. Because unlike their testimony from last July, we have the documents now that actually show how things really went down, something we didn't have when we first questioned them. And they could have responded to all our challenges. If they had facts on their side, this was their opportunity to set the record straight. And any group, any organization that's looking to receive $912 million in taxpayers' money, they must be willing to show up and answer the hard questions. Instead, the key players in this scandal are refusing to testify and defy Parliament. We have an obligation as parliamentarians at committee to take the evidence heard at committee and present it to Parliament. We cannot be obstructed in this work just because the central people in the drama do not want to be accountable. And the fact that we've been forced to issue 4 legal summons to compel testimony from an international charity that has worked in the schools of all our children is a staggering situation. Charities are transparent. Charities are accountable. We should not be in a situation of having to issue 4 legal summons just to get answers about how they operate. But I would say, colleagues, that this issue is bigger than our committee and the Kielburgers, because the threat to defy illegal summons from Parliament is not simply obstruction. It is a challenge to the entire parliamentary system that we have, because what we do as parliamentarians sets precedent. And if we set a precedent that it's okay to ignore Parliament, then others will follow in due course, and it will undermine the democratic accountability mechanisms that we have. So we have a big issue before us. What I would like to do today is I'd like to amend my colleague's motion to state that we will give the Kielburger brothers until this Friday to appear. If they do not appear at committee by Friday, we will consider them to be obstructing and hostile to the work of the committee. We will prepare the report that we have been working on as we were intended to do and prepare that finding to Parliament. But we will also, and I'm asking my colleagues to consider, if they do not appear by Friday, to prepare another report to Parliament to refer this issue of contempt of our committee to Parliament for consideration. Thank you.
Okay, so I will consider that amendment in order. I'll go to Ms. Shanahan now. Ms. Shanahan.
Well, thank you very much, Chair. So I take it we're discussing the sub-amendment now?
Yeah, the amendment, that's right.
The amendment, yes, thank you. Chair, I think, well, it's the same remarks that I had for the motion in general, in that I too was very dismayed at the public statements that were made by the Kielburger brothers in the form of the letter that we all saw, and indeed, as a parliamentarian, I realize we deal with very difficult subjects, and but they're of importance to the Canadian people. And in that, our power to summons, to ask for witnesses. And I find that we have, and I'd like to congratulate you and the clerk that we've shown flexibility in requesting the appearance of witnesses, and I think that it's more than disrespect. It is a challenge to the authority that we have as parliamentarians to this committee. So in that regard, Chair, I don't think there's a member here that is in disagreement. We certainly, the timeline, we're in agreement with the amendment and with the motion in general. If the committee wants to move to unanimous consent on both of these motions, we are in agreement.
Thank you, Ms. Shanahan. There are 3 additional people on the speaking order now. It seems to me that they'd like to speak on it, and once they do, I hope that we can move to a vote. We'll move to Mr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and colleagues. We've heard that, as a parliamentary committee, we have the right to call witnesses. I would argue that we have an obligation to call these witnesses. Last meeting, we had a father pour out his heart about what he expected and what he worked hard for, the legacy of his son. And frankly, I think all of us were outraged, but also committed even more to getting to the bottom of this. He used the term, he says, I don't know who the bad guys are. And I committed to him that I would do my best to get to the bottom of it. When you have a witness come before you dealing with such high levels and charities saying that they've defrauded, I think it's up to all of us to pass this motion. And I'll let my colleague, Mr. Angus, know that I'm in favor of his amendment, because this is about the integrity and transparency, not only of our government, but our entire charity system. When I asked WE's government relations person last meeting if she was aware that Minister Morneau had not repaid $42,000 for his trip to Kenya, she said she had no idea. Well, Mr. Chair, I think somebody knows, and we need to get to the bottom of it. What kind of trip do you get for $42,000? I know people in Oshawa. I have many constituents that, for heaven's sakes, don't make that in a year. And frankly, this is not their money. This is the money of 14-year-olds who do bottle drives to give from their heart to this charity to make a difference in other children's lives. This is about 12-year-olds who collect for months and years for bake sales. Canadians and international donors, they deserve to have a system of integrity and transparency, a system that is free from scandal and above reproach without ever thinking about the possibilities of bribery, influence, peddling, or fraud. They deserve to know. And when we try to answer the question, who are the bad guys here? The Kielburgers' behavior is kind of narrowing that in my mind. So I think, Mr. Chair, as I said, this is not just a right, this is an obligation. We need to move forward with this motion as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. We'll turn to Monsieur Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will not repeat all that has already been said by our colleagues of the committee, but I would like to say that I totally agree with them. I read the letter from the lawyer of the Kielburger brothers, and I found that somewhat delicate as a lawyer myself. I don't believe I would have written such a letter, at least in that way. I may understand his position that he doesn't want his clients to appear, but it looks to me that somebody is announcing in advance that they will be in contempt of Parliament. I think that is unacceptable. I know that with the We Charity issue and involving the Prime Minister, we need to go to the bottom of it. And we discussed that in various committees. But I agree with all that was said. But beyond those issues, we cannot allow or tolerate that somebody tell us in advance that they are going to defy any summons that the Parliament could issue. It's one thing not to agree with a summons. You could come up with a letter. There are a number of legal avenues if you feel that the summons is not valid, but you cannot say that I have no intention to obey those summons. I don't care what you think. That is unacceptable. If we tolerate that, I don't know how far this will go, but at least we need to react. The Kielburger brothers, in any case, have an advantage to appear to explain themselves, either to correct what has already been said, because the allegations made are very serious. From all the testimonies we heard, the CBC report or article that I read, I also watched the Feed the State 2 weeks ago. And all that is really serious. The testimony of the gentleman, Mr. Cohen, I believe, Rick Cohen, rather, these are serious accusations. If I were one of the Kielburger brothers, I want to explain myself. I don't understand that they want to hide. Beyond that, as MPs, we do have a responsibility. Our responsibility is to tell Canadians that when a summons is issued, you must obey the summons. If you do not agree, there's a process that you can use to request an appeal, but you cannot yourself say that you cannot respect the summons. So for those reasons, Mr. Chair, I have the intention to support the motion and the amendment. I agree with Mr. Angus's amendment. I have no problem with that, whether it's this week or next week, but we should request that they appear immediately and the message should be clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gord. We'll turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would not take a lot of your time. I agree with the amendment. I agree with the motion. I was very disappointed Friday when we received the letter saying that those two gentlemen would lead us into unending procedures. It is disappointing for our committees. It is disappointing for Canadians who are entitled to the truth. We need to know what the Kielburger brothers have to say to us, considering all we've heard and all the work we've done. It makes no sense that they refuse to speak to a parliamentary committee. It should be an honor to be invited to appear before a committee to explain oneself. And now people are ignoring an opportunity to explain themselves. So I won't take your time. I believe we can go to the vote immediately if no one else objects. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, colleagues. We will now, I'm not seeing anybody else wanting to intervene, and so we will move first to the vote on the amendment. So I will seek committees. It looks like there's unanimous consent to move on the amendment. I'm seeing heads nodding. Is there anybody opposed to moving the amendment? There is full support for the amendment. For the amended motion then, colleagues, it looks like there is support for that, but I will ask, is there anybody opposed to the motion? Not seeing any opposition. That motion is moved unanimously by this committee, and so I will sign the summons as soon as possible, as soon as it can be drafted, and that will be delivered to the Kielburger lawyers as soon as possible. Colleagues, we do have a few other items with regards to committee business. I did want to inform committee members that the MindGeek documents have been given to our committee, have been delivered. The ones that we have requested, the introductory letter alone was 7 pages long, and so that has been translated now and circulated to the members. Hopefully you've been able to receive that. The remaining documents are thousands of pages in documentation, and so what we have asked is that the analysts review the documentation first to ensure that all things that were requested are included in that compilation of documents. And so we will hear back from the analyst once they've been able to confirm but you can imagine that it's going to take a little bit of time for those documents to be translated before they can be distributed. But we did want to give you a heads up in terms of those facts. Hopefully every member has been able to read at least the introductory letter that was circulated to members. In terms of the WE study, pardon me, the cover letter, the 7 pages, I said it has been delivered. It has not yet been delivered. So you haven't read it yet because you haven't received it yet, but you will receive it today. Apologies to members for that. In terms of the WE study, the letter has been sent from the committee with the questions that committee members had with regards to Victor Lee and his counsel, and so we will expect that those will be responded to according to the instructions by committee, and we will continue to keep committee members informed. But I just wanted to inform you that we are on track to, at least we've done our part in terms of getting those out to him, and we will inform committee members if we hear anything back from
point of order
Victor
to that.
Lee. Yes, Mr. Angus.
Yeah, because one of the things that concerned me in the letter from the lawyers from the Kielburger brothers, that they said that nobody from WE leadership would participate. I would place the CFO, Mr. Victor Lee, as one of the WE leadership. So do we have a sense that he's willing to continue to work with us, or did this letter from the Kielburger brothers include Mr. Victor Lee as no longer being willing to provide information on the finances of this organization?
We haven't had any correspondence from him since we delivered the questions, so we don't know. I guess we will find out. It was startling, I think, for all committee members to read the letter generally, but also to see the letter speak on behalf of a whole host of folks that weren't named in it. Obviously, it's concerning to. I've heard it's concerning to committee members, and so we will be mindful of that and inform you immediately if we hear anything back in terms of their intention to respond to those letters as they agreed to. In terms of, pardon me, I just have to reference my notes here. We do have a budget that has been prepared by the clerk for the Pornhub study, and I think that budget has been circulated. It's in the amount.
Mr. Chair, point of order, please. I understand that we voted unanimously in favor of the amendment by Mr. Angus. That's good. But we did not vote on the main motion. I believe we need to do that, unless I'm mistaken. I think that motion, first of all, has to be adopted. And I would like to announce right away that I will be proposing a study of 3 short motions tabled by my colleague, Ms. Kodro. But first of all, I think we need to vote on the main motion as amended.
I did ask members if there was anybody who opposed it, and I did rule that, in fact, that had been accepted by committee members. And so, not having seen any opposition to that, I said it was unanimously passed. And so that is completed. I do have a couple of people on my speaking list. I'd like to get this budget passed by committee members just before I begin that. I know Mr. Angus wants to get on the speaking list right away as well. But in terms of the budget, have members been able to review that? I don't think that there's been any concerns raised with regards to what is a modest budget for that particular study. Not seeing anybody who wants to speak on that. I will ask, is there anybody who opposes that budget for that particular study? Not seeing that, I will accept that as having been passed by committee unanimously. Mr. Angus, will turn to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've brought forward 2 motions. One is a long-standing motion that we've agreed to in the past on facial recognition technology, which I would like to bring forward if we were waiting for the privacy law bill, but if it's not coming up, I would like to get the facial recognition technology study underway in the meantime. But my motion I'd like to bring first out of the 2 motions is following up on the issue of the questions that have arisen out of the Pornhub MindGeek study. I think we have all learned a great deal. I think we are in a position somewhat ready to present to start working on a report. But to me, there's one fundamental outstanding question, which is that we seem to have very strong laws in this country regarding non-consensual images, issues of child porn. we've looked at the laws, they're strong, but we don't see any enforcement mechanisms. So my motion is that pursuant to Standing Order 1083, and in light of the testimony from representatives of the RCMP at committee on February 22nd, 2021, and the apparent lack of enforcement of Canadian laws relating to issues of possession and dissemination of child pornography, as well as the posting of non-consensual sexual acts on Canadian internet services, that the committee immediately call Public Safety Minister Bill Blair to appear and explain his government's position on enforcement of Canadian laws relating to the non-consensual abuse of both children and adults on online platforms. And I bring forward this motion because I think we can't really make recommendations to Parliament until we know what it is that is politically or higher above the RCMP, that the laws that Parliament has adopted are not actually being enacted. So I'd like to ask Mr. Bill Blair to come and say how they perceive it, and then we can prepare our report to Parliament. So I'd put that motion on the floor for debate.
Okay, we do have a motion before us. We'll get a speaking list on that. I know Mr. Fortin also would like to move a motion.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, I announced already that I would like the committee to discuss the 3 short motions tabled by Ms. Kodro before you hear Mr. Angus. I am not undermining the importance of Mr. Angus's motion. I think it's important and something that the committee needs to discuss. But there were 3 motions, 3 short motions that were already discussed. I think that we can resolve that in 5 minutes. Mr. Chair, I believe that I was the only one who raised my hand and made that announcement, so I don't understand why you do not want to discuss that issue now.
I do apologize. I did have Mr. Angus on my speaking list. He doesn't show up on the Zoom speaking list because he is in person. So Mr. Barrett and Mr. Angus have to inform the clerk or myself if they want to be. Mr. Angus in this case was on the list before you, but we will get to you as soon as we can dispose of the motion that's currently before the committee. Is there anybody that would like to speak to Mr. Angus's motion? Not seeing anybody.
Chair?
Pardon me. Yes, Mr. Barrett.
Yep, thanks very much. I'm supportive of Mr. Angus's motion, and I think it's important that we do have the opportunity for the minister to explain the government's position. But I would like to offer an amendment. It's small in the number of words, but I think it's large in the amount of the impact that it would have. And the amendment would be that we replace after Bill Blair with and Justice Minister David Lametti. So it would read that the committee immediately call Public Safety Minister Bill Blair and Justice Minister David Lametti to appear and explain their government's position on the enforcement of Canadian laws relating to the non-consensual abuse of both children and adults on online platforms. Thank you.
Mr. Fergus. Mr. Fergus, I saw that you were...
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to talk about Mr. Barrett's amendment. As much as I support Mr. Angus's motion, looking at the implementation of police services, I think that falls under the purview of the Minister of Public Safety. We are not discussing, or rather it doesn't fall under the purview of the Minister of Justice. Maybe Madam Clerk could confirm my interpretation, but in my opinion, that's the situation. It falls rather under the Minister of Public Safety, and that is why I support Mr. Angus's motion without that amendment. As desirable as it is, I know that Mr. Barrett did it with good faith, but it doesn't fall under the purview of the Minister of Justice.
We are now debating the amendment. We'll turn to Ms. Latanzio and then Mr. Carey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ma question est adressée à...
My question goes to Mr. Barrett. I would like to have some clarification in the same vein as my colleague, Mr. Fergus. By asking the Minister of Justice to appear to talk about the implementation of the laws, what is his role in this amendment? I'm trying to understand the appearance. I could understand the appearance of Mr. Blair, but unless there are other things, or are we simply limiting ourselves to the implementation of our laws? So I would like to hear more about that so I can be able to take an informed decision. Thank you.
Mr. Carey, we'll turn to you.
And put me on the list.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Maybe I can help my my Liberal friends. There was a huge rejig of I think it was Bill C-75, where the Liberals passed a reform of the criminal justice system. And one of the things that was in that bill, it was a change in regards to human trafficking, where in some instances, instead of being a criminal offense, it was going to be moved into a summary conviction, which for anybody who is not a legal person, that means it could be 2 years minus a day and a $5,000 fine, which for human traffickers, which we have heard quite regularly through the study that we're talking about, are extremely active in recruitment and abuse in regards to these images on the internet. So I think Mr. Lametti, who made that change, I think it would be great to have him in front of committee to explain the implications, and maybe instead of making the issue, let's just say, less common, perhaps we're seeing a greater incentive for these traffickers to, instead of, let's just say, being found guilty in the United States, in Canada, there's much less risk. So a $5,000 fine, that could be seen if one person is trafficked. We've heard numbers of $250,000, $300,000 per year they can make on one trafficked person. This would just be the cost of doing businesses. So maybe this would be something that Mr. Lametti could explain to committee and maybe take a second look.
Thank you. I have Mr. Angus and then Mr. Sabero on the list. Mr. Angus.
Thank you. Well, to sort of work in between both my Liberal and Conservative colleagues, we are not studying human trafficking here. We are, and that was something we had to be very clear at the beginning, because that's really the purview of justice or status of women. However, I do support calling the Minister of Justice, because I think it's pretty straightforward. The laws that we have clearly not been enacted. So by asking the security minister to come, he could explain the overall culture in terms of how the laws are being interpreted. But by having the justice minister, he could explain whether or not the laws are sufficient. I think this is an important conversation. I don't see that this is adversarial. I want to know, do we need to come forward with changes to the law to make them actually applicable and enforceable, or the law is sufficient, and is it a question that the police are not doing that? And so I think having the two of them there, staying focused on that, we could get straight answers. And I don't think that this has to be something we debate. I will certainly support the amendment of my colleague.
Mr. Sabera.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. This is my first intervention this morning. So again, just want to join and say Happy International Women's Day to all the wonderful women in our society. In terms of the debate at hand, the issue with the Minister Lametti inviting him, I'm going to disagree, only because I think the human trafficking aspect is not relevant to the study at hand, and secondly, that is an issue that really pertains to the Justice Committee, and the reasons that have been given out really pertain to the Justice Committee and not our committee and not this study. I would like to add that I would actually like to see the head of the RCMP, the director of public prosecution, be called. I think those two individuals would be much more relevant than the justice minister. I think we've I don't want to say people have gone offside, but I think in terms of the focus, in terms of why the existing laws that are on the books are or are not being used, or some clarification questions that I know many of my colleagues here have, I think that would be the angle that I would think would be more productive in the time allotted that we have currently to go down. So that's those are my humble thoughts there. Thank you, Chair, and good morning again to everyone.
Okay, colleagues, I don't have anybody else on the speaking order. What I'll do is then now ask in terms of the amendment on the motion. I get a sense that we're divided, that there's some division with regards to this. So I think what I'll ask is that members raise their hands either in support of the amendment. Ms. Shanahan, I see that your hand has been raised. Is that to speak to the motion before we go to the vote? Ms. Shanahan, you're just on mute still.
Thank you very much, Chair. In that, I think while we're adding names to the motion, I'd like to propose, I move that sub-amendment that we add Brenda Lucky's name and the Director of Prosecution's name to the motion.
Okay, so this is an amendment to the amendment. So let's, I guess we'll deal with that first. Is there anybody that would like to speak with regards to the sub-amendment?
Let's vote.
Let's vote. So we'll first vote in terms of adding Miss Lucky's name to the list. All those in favor, please indicate by raising your raised hand.
Sorry, Chair.
Mr. Angus.
Point of order. I think Madame Shannon, did she say Madame Leckie and the Director of Public Prosecutions? That's what I thought she said. So wouldn't that have to be that you name them both for the sub amendment?
Sorry, I missed that. Yeah, I'm seeing that there's indication that in fact was the intention. Okay, so was this a sub-amendment to the list, or was this a separate amendment? I guess is the first question.
I accept it as a friendly sub-amendment.
Okay, very good. So it'll be a sub-amendment. So we are currently voting on adding the public prosecution and the commissioners' names. All those in favor, please indicate by a raised hand on your icons. I'm getting that is passed unanimously, and so now we will move to the amendment, which is now amended to include three names.
Mr. Chair, I just want to note that it wasn't passed unanimously.
Oh, pardon me.
I had not put up my hand.
I apologize. Yes, thank you, Mr. Fergus. Thank you, Mr. Fergus.
So, Chair, that'll just pass on division then? Because I'm just not sure on a point of order, Chair, if I can. I'm just not sure if we can exercise a vote by raised hand. So perhaps, and I might be getting some gentle coaching from the clerk who is sitting 6 feet away from me right now. So. We can accept it on division. We can't do by raised hand. So I guess it's consensus, division, or roll call. Is that correct, Chair? Or
there we go.
Clerk? Yeah. Okay.
Well, I should be paying attention to the clerk as well. Very good. I appreciate the instruction and the help. And if I would simply watch my text, this would work a lot easier. So now we will move to the amendment that has been amended. And so all those in favor indicate in some way your support now. I guess I'll ask: is there anybody opposed? Is there anybody opposed to the amendment?
Mr. Chair, for the benefit
Mr. Latanzio.
I'm sorry, can you just read out the amendment so it's clear to everyone on what we're voting? Thanks.
So the amendment now includes the Minister of Justice, and then the two additional names of the Commissioner and the Public Prosecution. So that those three names are now the amendment. Anybody opposed to that? Okay, I've got a couple of hands, three hands. all hands. I think then we can move that it was passed on division. Now we are moving to the amended motion in its entirety, which includes all of those names added to the public safety minister. Not seeing anybody wanting to speak to that again, we'll move to a vote. Is there anyone opposed to the motion as it's been amended? Not seeing any, we will move that is approved on division. Thank you. Mr. Fortin, we'll turn to you now.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It was approved on division. I imagine that we were unanimous on the motion. Well, that's a minor technicality that you can resolve. What I would like to ask the committee is to adopt the 3 motions that were tabled on notice by Ms. Gaudreau recently, to add to our standing orders routine motion. Should I take it in order? I have no objection to the 3. I will read them out, and I will not engage in any long discussions. Unless there's a mistake, I am sure that everyone is aware of those motions. I have the impression that we all agree. Do you have a preference as to the order in which I should read them, Mr. Chair? No. So I will start with the first.
I don't have a preference, but I would like to deal with them one at a time. I see Mr. Fergus is, maybe that was exactly what, let's deal with one motion at a time. I don't think it's, I have no preference in which order that you.
Alors, je vais y aller avec la...
I'll start with the first on technical test for witnesses, that all documents filed as part of committee business that is not from the federal government, not translated by the Translation Bureau, be submitted for linguistic revision before they are distributed to members of the committee. There were some problems in some committees, and it was agreed that this provision be adopted. I don't know if in the Ethics Committee there were any problems before. I don't believe so. But the question has to be clear to make sure that documents that are tabled are revised, both in English and in French, and that the translations are consistent with the spirit. That's the spirit of the proposal. That's it.
D'accord.
Very well.
The clerk is circulating that again for members if they don't have it in front of them. I'm seeing Mr. Fergus raising his hand. Was that to get on the speaking order? Mr. Fergus, we'll turn to you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleague from the Bloc Québécois, someone I have a lot of respect for, especially when it comes to the promotion of the French language. As you all know, I'm a great supporter of French. The question I have has to do with the content of the motion, because it would appear to me that that is something, maybe it's the clerk would correct me if I'm wrong, but the translations of motions or of any documents that fall under the committee go through a drafting process in accordance with the standards of other translations, whether they go through the Translation Bureau or through other departments. Can the clerk explain to us the process that is in place today? If you allow, Mr. Chair, I could answer that question being asked by my colleague, Mr. Fergus. We are talking about the wording. It said that for documents that have not been translated by the Translation Bureau or that are not coming from the federal department, so a document being sent by a witness, for example. Very well, I'm sorry.
Okay, we're going to continue in speaking order here. Mr. Carey, you're on the speakers list, and then we'll, if anybody has additional questions after, we can see if we can add some clarity to that. Mr. Carey, and then Ms. Shanahan.
Oui, Monsieur le Chair.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I want to thank my colleague for this motion. I would like to add a few words.
Say that all documents submitted for committee business that do not come from the federal department, and I'd like to add the words member's office, le bureau des membres.
Member's office.
If something comes translated from the a member's office, it doesn't get caught up in the process for further translation.
J'accepterai l'amendement de mon.
I accept that amendment, Mr. Chair.
But we're debating the amendment, I guess. Now, Ms. Shanahan, we'll turn to you.
Okay. Je m'excuse.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to understand the process. Right now, do we have witnesses who do their own translations? Is it always the Linguistic Bureau of the House that provides that service? I understand that there are some standards that we have in place in Parliament, and it's important to maintain those standards. But sometimes, even myself, when I receive documents in French, coming from a Francophone, sometimes things are not always said the way they should be said because our vocabulary is different. So in a certain sense, I understand the principle behind the motion, but we want to make sure that the process is efficient and that the quality is maintained, but we do not want to prevent the work of the committee. We want to hear what the witnesses are saying directly. Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Not seeing any additional speakers on this, I will move to a vote. Is there anyone who is opposed to this motion? The amendment. We're going to vote on the amendment first. Anyone opposed to the amendment? Not seeing anybody, we'll consider that passed. Is there anybody who would like to speak on the motion as amended? Not seeing anybody. We'll ask if there's anybody opposed to that. Not seeing anybody, we will consider that motion passed. Mr. Fortin, we'll go back to you for, I believe you've indicated that you have 3 motions you'd like to move.
Yeah. Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll read the second motion now. It was tabled concerning documents translated by the Translation Bureau, that the clerk inform any witness to appear that technical tests by the support team have to take place to ensure the connectivity and the appliances used to make sure that everything goes well, and that the chair inform the committee at the beginning of every meeting of any witness that has not done the required technical test. Here again, Mr. Chair, the problem was not necessarily raised in all committees, but in some committees it was a problem. The objective is to make sure that those working in the translation service can hear the testimonies well and are in a position to offer faithful interpretations. So that's the essence of carrying out technical tests before the meeting starts. So that would prevent sittings being delayed because the witnesses were not using the right equipment also. So thank you.
Thank you. We'll turn to Ms. Shanahan.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Once again, I understand the principle of the motion, but I believe that it's already done. Maybe the rules are there, and I believe that the clerk and the other employees are trying to implement the rules. It's a matter of time, and sometimes there are problems because of lack of time. On that issue, I'm trying to understand whether there's something missing in the rules, because once again, I'm sure that we do need to listen to witnesses in the right way, but we also understand that sometimes there are technical problems that could arise. So I'd like to hear what the clerk has to say about that.
Yeah, I can inform members that every effort is undertaken to do a technical test before committee meetings. We've had the experience even in our own committee meeting here where technical tests were undertaken even days in advance, and then partway through a particular meeting, things change technically, and the challenges then persist from there on in. So while it is the usual practice, it has not been codified through a motion. Every effort has up until this point been to it is a protocol within the offices to ensure that every witness does have a technical test, but of course challenges do arise. I hope that answers the question. We'll go to Ms. Latanzio.
And then me.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to inform you of the fact that I also sit as a member on the Language Committee, and we have carried out a study on technical problems, the Zoom platform, all that had to do with making sure that every member of parliament and witnesses appearing before us in committee receive the right equipment and be able not only to testify properly regarding the translation and interpretation of their speech and interventions. So, dear colleagues, we are getting ready to table a report very soon on the study that was carried out, an exhaustive study. We heard testimonies from various witnesses, and on this motion, unfortunately, I cannot support it for the simple and good reason that, in my opinion, a study has already been done. I would rather propose that once that study by the Language Committee is adopted and tabled, we'll have time to read it and study it, and if there's something missing, then subsequently either Mr. Fortin or Ms. Gaudreau could maybe retable another proposal, because in my opinion, the matter has already been studied by the Language Committee. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Angus now.
Merci.
Thank you. It's very important for the committee and members of the committee to have access to professional translations and for witnesses to have the capacity to speak via Zoom. And we do know that it's complicated.
The motion, because of course this is a fundamental right. My only concern would be in making it a motion whether or not we are suggesting that this is not already the case. We are dealing with very difficult circumstances across sometimes not just the country, but internationally to get witness testimony. I would want to believe that at every opportunity, every effort is made by the clerk and the team to make sure that they work to a high level of professionalism. I wouldn't want someone to say that their privileges were being undermined because the motion wasn't respected if there are technical problems. There will be technical problems in everything we do. I'm interested in seeing the report from this Official Languages Committee. I'm more than willing to support this motion, but I'm suggesting that maybe we want to see this report and see the best way to make sure that we are ensuring that people have access and can hear the translations properly over Zoom or other tech or other forms. But maybe we want to hear from this committee report.
Mr. Dong, we'll turn to you.
Well, thank you, Chair. Happy International Women's Day to our female colleagues and Marian and to all the support staff. Thank you very much for all your work. And I understand where this motion, the intent of this motion, coming from. I remember from time to time, Madame Godor, even members from my own caucus, raised concern over technical difficulties and not be able to hear the proper translation. I understand the frustration there, and I also recognize the attempt by the clerk and all support staff tried to make this work. Unfortunately, we're under COVID. I see Zoom as a sort of a temporary measure. It's not going to be. We're not going to be seeing each other over a screen. I really miss those days, seeing everyone in person in the committee. My point is along the line of Mr. Angus as well. Respectfully, I understand that this is very frustrating at times, but also recognize that sometimes it'd be very, very difficult to make everything work. We're dealing with technology. I sometimes have a Wi-Fi problem as well. So everything can come into play when it comes to translation quality. So I respectfully, I would ask Monsieur Fortin if he would consider perhaps postponing the decision of this motion until the study from the language committee comes to a conclusion, and then it may enlighten us with some solutions that we can act on. But right now, I think the motion itself is great, well intended, but I don't know if the solution is there, and I just want to see things moving along smoothly, as smooth as possible for the committee. I don't want this motion to be necessary, sort of adding delays or more challenge to the very challenging situation already for the support staff. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We'll turn to Mr. Fortin. He's the last member on the speaking list. Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to learn that everyone agrees with the fact that it's something good to carry out technical tests before. I understand, Mr. Chair, you rightly mentioned that it's something which in reality is practiced regularly and very well. I think that's the case in almost all committees, but unfortunately, it's not yet included in routine motions, and I think it should be done. That being said, Mr. Chair, I believe that the team, and I believe everyone agrees with me, the translation teams and the technical teams are doing exceptional work during the pandemic. We all have to work in new ways with Zoom. My colleague said it's temporary, maybe. Well, we learned new words, présentiel in French, appearing in person in Parliament, but we don't know for how long we will be seeing each other via Zoom. But we need to make sure that we do the work the best way we can and provide people with the best appliances so that our work is done well. Out of respect for our witnesses, because I heard Mr. Angus say a while ago that we don't have to delay the testimony of witnesses because it's already difficult to get them. I agree with him. But simply to help them, because all this motion is saying, it's not saying that we are going to reject testimonies. It's just saying that before they start, there should be a rule inserted that before we start, technical tests be done with witnesses. I didn't hear any comments here saying that it's not a good idea. I believe we all agree it's a good idea. Now, concerning the fact that my colleague says that the Official Languages Committee is carrying a study on that. Very well. That being said, each committee is independent. It's not because the Official Languages Committee has adopted some provisions that members of other committees should agree. Well, it will be good. I believe we should all have the same internal rules. But at this time, every committee is independent, so we need to take a decision for ourselves, for the Ethics Committee, on how we function. I believe that if we agree on the substance that technical tests should be done with witnesses before to help the witnesses, to help our interpreters, to make sure that everything goes well during the testimony. If we agree with that, that motion should be adopted. If in a month, in a year, or in 2 years, the Official Languages Committee or any other committee tables a report that tells us that we could do better, then we could always amend our own rules. There's no problem. But in the meantime, while waiting for any possible report or decisions taken by other committees, I think it's wise for a committee to have its own simple rule, which falls in line with what is already being done, saying that before we hear a witness, we carry out technical tests. There you go.
Thank you. I don't have anybody else on my speaking order, so now we'll move to a vote.
Mr. Chair.
Is there anyone opposed to the
Chair, point of order?
Yeah, pardon me. Yes, point of order. Mr. Barrett.
Yeah, I just wanted to drop a flag there. Mr. Angus was trying to get in before you called the vote.
Pardon me. Mr. Angus.
Yes. It's not a problem. I'm ready for the vote. I will be supporting my colleague.
Je m'excuse.
I'm sorry.
Very good, colleagues. We'll move to the vote then. Is there anyone opposed to the motion? Indicate by raising of your hands. I see some opposition, but I see general agreement to allow this to pass, so I will declare that this motion passes. Mr. Fortin, we'll turn back to you. I believe you have one final motion that you'd like to move.
Oui, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. The last motion, substantive motion concerning official languages, it reads that the text of any substantive motion or any motion in amendment of a substantive motion be distributed in writing in both official languages to all committee members before the committee begins debate on such a motion. Listen, Mr. Chair. This also seems to me simple common sense. We all know that our parliament is bilingual and our business is done officially in both official languages. If we have to discuss a motion, it should be written in both official languages before we arrive at any decision. This prevents confusion. This prevents some members voting one way when they would have preferred to vote another way simply because they did not understand the motion. That's it. Thank you.
Ms. Shanahan?
Monsieur le Président.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Here again, I must say that I disagree with the motion presented by the Bloc Québécois. We have interpreters for a reason. They are the ones who interpret all the live debates in our committee. Even today, during this committee meeting, we have seen members amend amendments, or rather bring amendments. And I think that is part of our work to be able to work smoothly when we are discussing committee business. Let me seize the opportunity to remind members that we need to speak more slowly to help our interpreters to do their work. I think we have all been guilty at some point, and that's the reality. I do not believe that the obligation, unless members here present think that it could help the work of this committee, that we be obliged to start amending every motion before it's discussed here in committee. But for my part, I think It's well-intentioned, I must say, but it is a measure that is not necessary because we have excellent service from our interpreters who are able to make sure that all members understand what is going on during committee meetings. Of course, when we were attending sessions physically, we had the opportunity before to ask that a meeting be suspended for us to properly understand a motion. Sometimes motions are read out, and we make sure that the clerk is able to provide us with the proper motion. But we always have the opportunity to be open with one another, and I think that we have the process. But to oblige any action when it comes to motions, I think that would hurt our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got a few people on the speaking list. We'll turn to Mr. Angus, and then we'll go to Mr. Fergus, and then Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to say that I support Ms. Shanahan. I totally agree. That's a joke.
I understand my colleagues' preoccupation with this, but I've been in opposition for 17 years. And when you're in the opposition, and sometimes when you're the only member, the rights and privileges that you have at committee, you have to protect them because otherwise your voice can easily be shut down. And one of the rights I have is to be able to make amendments, to try and find a solution or to put forward something that I think is really important. To say we would have to stop the committee meeting and the committee business because it wasn't in writing could be used, I think, to shut down certain voices. I think it would certainly slow down the work of our committee, and it would make our ability to find our way through difficult situations impossible. And even today, we've had a couple of amendments. Imagine having to stop and say, well, we'll wait till Friday before we get it all written down and then we can agree to it. It would be untenable and it would interfere with our work. So I'm ready for a vote on this.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Fergus.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to commend the fact that my colleague was well-intentioned in tabling that motion, but I'm somewhere between Mr. Angus and Ms. Shanahan. I think Mr. Fortin said it's not necessarily concerning amendments, but basic amendments or basic motions, if I understood his motion well. The problem I have with that is that it hampers the privileges of an MP to have to suggest after a discussion, a testimony that a motion has to be tabled. I would propose, and this has been done before, if something is very complicated, very often we take a few minutes, we take a short break to write the motion down. We ask the clerk to circulate the motion in writing to all members of parliament by email. Sometimes she is not in a position to circulate anything if it's not translated. And then translations are done with the assistance of our interpreters or with any available staff. So I think it's important to preserve this flexibility in the way we work in committee. I hope that when it's possible, motions be tabled in writing and circulated 48 hours in advance. But let's allow some flexibility to make sure that we can work when necessary to respond to concerns that may come up during committee business. So I cannot support that motion as proposed right now. Thank you.
Okay, Monsieur Fortin, you're the last person that's indicated that you would like to speak on this. Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My friend, Mr. Angus, was saying that he was surprised. He was agreeing with Ms. Shannon. Same for me. I agree with her and Mr. Fergus. I understand that the intention is not to delay committee business. In the contrary, to make sure that our work is done efficiently and diligently. Listen, if you want, I could propose an amendment to my own motion. We could leave out the section that talks about amendments to a substantive motion. So we maintain only the substantive motion. The spirit behind this proposal is to say that we want some substantive motions, the ones that are written in advance. Because when we know we want to table a motion, we make sure that it's done in both official languages. But when it comes to amendments during committee business, we do understand, like Mr. Angus's example is a good one. A while ago, there was an amendment, and we all agreed with the amendment. And I get back to what Mr. Fergus said. When there's a very complex or laborious amendment, we take a break, and then we write it down. Then the translators are there to have it translated in both official languages, and then they are circulated to members, as Mr. Fergus said. I agree with that. We can't be perfect, but that's an effective way of working. So on the motion I tabled, Mr. Chair, I agree that in the French version, we remove the idea, any other amendment to the substantive motion. In English, we remove the phrase or any motion in amendment of a substantive motion. So we could take that out, and we leave the rest of the motion. I think there was no negative comment regarding the rest of the motion. So it could pass as amended now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'm going to intervene and take the chair's prerogative. Mr. Fortin, it's actually not possible for you to amend your own motion. And of course, if it was allowable, if your motion passed, it would no longer be allowable. And so I think we probably should go to a vote. And then if you would like to bring it back in an amended form, we could do that. If you'd like to withdraw it, we can get unanimous consent to do that, or we can simply go to the vote.
Je comprends, monsieur.
I understand, Mr. Chair. I agree with you that it should come from someone else, maybe Mr. Angus or Ms. Chanel. They could propose the amendment. Well, it's up to you. Otherwise, we could vote on it as proposed.
Okay, Ms. Shanahan, you're still on the speaking list. I think you'll be the last before we go to the vote.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I would move to voting on the motion as tabled because, in my opinion, whether it's a motion, amendment, or sub-amendments, it's the same principle. We should be able to amend anything when we are in committee. Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting a sense that there's concerns with this motion and not overwhelming support. And so I will simply ask if there's members that want to indicate their support for it. And then...
Moi, je demanderais un vote.
I'll request a nominal vote, Mr. Chair.
That will make this very helpful. We'll turn to the clerk to do a roll call vote.
Okay. Sur la motion de Monsieur.
My hand up.
Oh, pardon me, Mr. Dong. I do apologize. We'll go to you before the roll call. Mr. Dong.
Thank you, Chair, for recognizing me. I don't intend to have the last word on this, but since we're going to have a recorded vote, I want to make sure viewers understand where I'm coming from making that decision. I won't be supporting this motion for the reason that was stated before, I think in practice, I agree with Monsieur Fortin, and I agree with the intention of the motion in respect of both official language in our parliament sitting and all these procedures. But I think in practice, it makes it very, very difficult for members to quickly raise a point, perhaps amend a motion, or for members that realize that their own motion, could be improved and looking for a colleague to make amendment, that would delay the process. And for example, what we're dealing with right now will probably take another 10-minute suspension for everything to translate it. I think it would just prolong the procedure. For that reason, I cannot support this motion. I just want to make sure that's on record. Thank you, Chair.
Very good. You requested not to have the last word, so Ms. Latanzio, it looks like we'll have the last word.
Oops, thank you. I'm just going to be brief. Colleagues, I think that it's quite apparent in terms of what has transpired in the last 5-10 minutes. Each of us collectively, in each our own turn, have made amendments here this morning, and we've seen how we've expressed that amendment in either French or in English. So it's almost ironic to a certain degree of how this has gone. I think that each member brings to the table an amendment, and then there's an understanding that it's done almost simultaneously, and then we vote quickly to sort of delay the process in terms of getting an official translation, or as is suggested, or my understanding of this motion. So for that very reason, I think that we've worked well together, and I think that I'd like to pursue in that vein, and for those reasons I'm going to object to this motion. Thank you.
Very good. Nobody else is indicating. Monsieur Fortin, I guess we'll let you have the last word.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what is being said concerning the need to act diligently when we are sitting to make verbal amendments. I do agree with that. But we also need to understand the reality. We are in a bilingual country, but the reality is that, take for example, I'm the only Francophone here. I see Mr. Good, and I believe that's all. Most of the other colleagues, except for Mr. Fergus, who speaks the two languages very well, but it's not the case for everyone. So Francophone members of parliament, you should understand that in reality, beyond the legal text, they are victims of the fact that they are Francophones. When there's a simple amendment like the one we heard this morning, it's okay. But when we are dealing with a substantive motion, Mr. Chair, it's sometimes complicated. There are language subtleties. But if it's written down in both official languages, we make sure that the decision taken, that the voting that will be done by members of the committee will be done following a proper understanding of the motion proposed. I do not know why we impose that a substantive motion be written in both official languages. And once again, those amongst us who are Francophones, and I know members of parliament who do not speak English, so you should understand that when a substantive motion is presented verbally, sometimes with 5, 6, 7 lines, and it's simply translated by the translation service, and sometimes because of the sound problems and so on, there are some problems. A motion was once presented to me by an Anglophone colleague, done out of good faith, but the translation was totally contrary to what was said. And I was getting ready to vote against until the clerk said, well, I will send you a written translation. And it totally changed my position. So I think that we must understand that we're working in a bilingual parliament. I, as a Francophone, would like my Anglophone colleagues to receive a written document of my proposal so that they can properly understand what I'm saying. Because there are always arguments for and against, and it's good. But if someone is prevented from properly understanding a motion being tabled, well, I'll say it's surprising. And let me repeat, I'm talking mainly about the substantive motion. So to reject my motion on the basis of amendments, whereas I'm proposing that I can amend it, well, I'll stop there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Just to be clear, colleagues, we're voting on the motion unamended as the text was presented and circulated in both official languages. We'll turn to the clerk now for a vote for the roll call.
Sur la motion de Monsieur Fortin.
On Mr. Fortin's motion, all those in favor say yes. All those against say nay.
Nay.
Monsieur Fergus.
Madame la greffière, je vote contre.
Madame Latancio.
Madame la greffière, je vais voter contre.
Against. Against. Nay. Nay.
Contre.
Against.
Monsieur Gould. Monsieur Gould.
Je vais voter pour.
I'll vote for.
Fortin.
Pour.
In favor.
Angus.
Je vais voter contre.
Nay.
Yeas pour 2, 2. Nays contre 8, 8.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. I will declare that motion defeated. Colleagues, I think that addresses everything that we had on the agenda or that needed to be addressed today. Oh, Mr. Angus.
Yeah. Sorry, Mr. Chair, and I just want to know whether it needs a second vote or not, but I had brought forward the motion that we'd already voted on the facial recognition study that has been put aside because of all the other things like the WE scandal and that. I'm suggesting that we bring it back forward because we are finishing up soon, I believe, the Pornhub study. We are going to be sending directions to our the analysts to start preparing the WE report. So there'll be time for that. We're waiting on a government bill on privacy. So I was thinking that if in the meantime we could start to work on facial recognition, it would give our clerks, we could start to draw the witnesses, and it would give us some work that we can do in between these other big projects that are sort of nearing completion. So if my colleagues, I don't know if we need to have it as a vote or this is something we voted on, but I'm willing to have a second vote on it.
Yeah, it has been approved as a study of this committee, but you are correct in terms of the timing hasn't been fully agreed upon. Of course, we've been having to juggle a couple of hearings, two different studies already. But certainly, I'd be interested to hear committee members with regards to this, Mr. Fergus.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Chair, I think it's time for us to immediately act on that motion, if possible. Unfortunately, the time is ticking already. That company has stopped their work on the preparation of the software at the beginning of the pandemic. I have concerns that they may restart work. No administration in the world has been able to regulate that technology. So I believe that Mr. Angus's motion received unanimity the last time it was tabled for the very first time at the beginning of 2020, before the pandemic. I think it's time for us to act on that. It's very important, especially for racialized groups. because we know that software doesn't work very well with those faces. So I hope we can quickly start a study on that topic.
Mr. Dong, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Chair. I agree with Mr. Fergus that this is a very important study for a racialized population in our country. And I want to thank Mr. Angus for bringing this up again. I believe this was passed in the last Parliament, but I don't recall that we actually voted on this motion to study during this Parliament. And because I brought it up during the We Charity debate and tried to move this forward, and you know, I don't think it was accepted. It was, but never received a debate, and that's why I don't recall it was ever being voted on. So I want to check with the clerk and through chair, and then just to see if there was a record that this was voted and passed and ready for study.
My recollection is that this has been agreed to be moved forward in terms of the study. It seems like there's a general agreement to work on this study as we complete these other studies and fill in the dates that are available with regards to these studies and begin that process. But one thing we would, I guess, request, I don't think we need to go to a vote because there seems to be, there has been agreement to move into the study in the past, and certainly there seems to be agreement today. What we would need is for members to begin the process of supplying witnesses. And so I would ask that any member that has a couple of things, first, witnesses with regards to this study, but also any witnesses that members believe are necessary to complete either of the other two studies, to get those into the clerk as soon as possible, and then we can have discussions with regards to either any of those witnesses as a subcommittee or as a committee at the next opportunity when we have committee business, which I imagine will be set aside sometime soon. We'll turn to Mr. Fergus now.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, for clarification purposes, Mr. Angus has asked this question before. Do we need a motion saying that, okay, now we should start the study, or do we just leave it unless for obligations we have for discussing government bills? But beyond that, can we agree that our next study will be this one without a decision being taken by the committee for it to be put aside?
Yeah, so we're just double checking the minutes to ensure that that was actually passed in an earlier meeting. My recollection is that it was, but if it wasn't, I take consent. I believe that there's consent and a committee, the will of the committee. I'm getting a sense that there's, you know, we can move another motion, but certainly I think that there's agreement right this minute to proceed with that motion at this time, and so I'm taking direction from the committee in that form.
Chair, I mean, I have language that I could read for the motion if people want to be official.
Well, why don't we do that then?
Okay. Okay, I'll read this in. That pursuant to Standing Order 1083H8, the committee study the use or possible use of facial recognition technology by various levels of government in Canada, law enforcement agencies, private corporations, and individuals. That the committee investigate how this technology will impact the privacy, security, and safety of children, seniors, and vulnerable populations. That the committee examine the impact of facial recognition technology on racialized communities. And that the study include how this technology may be used nefariously, such as a tool for criminal harassment or for other unlawful surveillance purposes. That the committee investigate any possible link, formal or informal, between Canadian law enforcement agencies and private technology corporations or startups. That the committee examine the impacts of facial recognition technology and the growing power of artificial intelligence. So that was the motion that I brought to update last October, because the original motion, I believe, talked about Clearview AI, who are no longer in Canada. But this would be the general parameters of the study. If we vote on it, I would be prepared to start sending some witnesses that we could start to look at this as we finalize the other studies that we have before us.
Okay, committee members, I do know that this motion has been circulated in the past, but I'm not sure that everybody has it at the moment. I will ask the clerk to see if she can locate the translated version of that motion and circulate it to members now to ensure that everybody does have a copy in both official languages.
Monsieur le Président, pourrait-on...
Mr. Chair, could we take a 2-minute break?
I'll suspend the meeting. I'll suspend the meeting for 2 minutes. Back to order. I think that everyone's had an opportunity to see the translated motion. I have Mr. Sabera on the speaking list. We'll turn to Mr. Sabera.
Very quickly, Chair, excuse me. I'm obviously very, very for this. When the Privacy Commissioner released their report a few months ago, I think it was, I read it, took the time, and there was a lot of things in there. I wanted questions to be asked about where we're going down in this road as a society. So I'm in favor of this motion. Thank you.
Okay, not having any additional speakers, we'll move to a vote. Anyone opposed to this motion? Not seeing any opposition, I declare this motion carried on division. Very good. I do have Mr. Angus on the speaking list again, Mr. Angus.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank all my colleagues for showing that we can all work together on such important issues, and this facial recognition technology study, I think, is going to be very important for Canadians, as well as internationally, the potential. Mr. Chair, I just want to bring to your attention that as we have been trying to get testimony from the Kielburger brothers, as they have defied our parliament, as they said they will ignore a legal summons, it has been brought to my attention that they're running Facebook ads today, that Facebook ads are being paid to say forensic analysis exonerates We Charity. It's put out by a group called friendsofwe.org that I believe is paid for by the Stillman Foundation. The Stillman Foundation, as we know, that paid full-page ads while our committee was unable to do our work. The Stillmans, who were the key people put by the Kielburgers to deal with our witness, Reed Cowan. I think it is an incredible act of arrogance and complete disregard for democratic rights, particularly on behalf of a group of people who've received the Order of Canada, that they would be running Facebook ads, patting themselves on the back while showing such contempt for Parliament. I just would like to have that on the record, Mr. Chair.
Very good. That is unsettling. Is there anybody else that has any final comments with regards to this committee business?
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Chair, a motion was tabled by Ms. Goodall concerning measures for protecting private information. I propose that we look at it and vote on it now. Since she's not here, do you want me to read it out, Mr. Chair? I can read it out.
I'll just ask, was it a motion that had been tabled with the committee already?
Oui, oui, ça a été.
Yes.
We'll suspend so that the clerk can find that and then distribute that. We'll suspend for a couple of minutes here.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr.
call this meeting back to order. I think that we've got a couple of members that who have their camera on, but I'm assuming that they're behind the blank screens. There we go. Very good. Do I have anybody who would like to speak to this motion?
I will.
Mr. Angus.
Thank you. I appreciate my colleague bringing forward this motion. I'm not against it. I'm wondering whether or not it's within the purview of our committee, whether it should be under finance or one of the others. But I would suggest if we're going to do that, maybe we could begin with an initial set of meetings. Like, I don't know how many meetings we'd have, but if we could we could talk about maybe key people from the ministries who could come and explain, and then we could decide if we, where to go from there. But I don't have a problem with it.
Mr. Fergus.
Pour abondir dans le même sens.
In the same vein as Mr. Angus, I know that other parliaments have done so, but I don't know if it's the practice for a while now, but is it possible for the analyst to give us a positioning paper, some sort of analysis of the situation, just to help us properly understand the situation when it comes to social insurance numbers? Just give us like an overview of the current situation and maybe a comparison with the European system. I would like to receive that before I say yes, I'll be supporting the motion. It's a topic I am not familiar with. I have almost no knowledge of that, so it's important for the table to be set before we start the process. Is that something that can be done?
We can ask our analysts to support us in different ways. I think that would be a reasonable request, but and we do have time, I guess. We do have now 3 studies that we've committed to. We do have time to make determinations as to if or not this is something that we want to proceed with, and we could ask our analysts to support us in that decision. That is a possibility. Ms. Shanahan.
Thank you, Chair. This is a topic that definitely is of interest to me, as many topics are, and that's what we've done a lot of work here today. And so I'd like to have a better understanding too about what the lay of the land is. This an exciting? I seem to remember that we did have some kind of discussion on this issue, and I think it was Mr. Angus that gave us the Coles notes on work that had been done in this committee in previous Parliament, but. Given the work that we have in front of us now, I'd like to have a better understanding, and maybe, especially since the member that brought forth the motion in the first place is not here today, maybe Madame Gaudreault would like to have an opportunity to speak on this. If we could get that summary. Or that kind of overview from the analysts, and then we would have time either in committee or in subcommittee to look at what the scheduling would look like. But we've got a lot on our plate right now. I'm just putting that out there. Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll turn to Mr. Fortin.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand what Ms. Shanahan is saying. Indeed, Ms. Gaudreault's presence may help. What I would like to propose, because this is an important topic, it's urgent given the times. Because of the pandemic, things that were urgent have become even more urgent, so it's even more complicated. So, Mr. Chair, if members of the committee agree, I propose we study this motion during the first session we have next week so that Ms. Goodrow can answer questions asked by other members of the committee, if there are any questions.
Okay, well, if that is, I think I understand that you would suggest that we would wait till Madame Goodrow returned to our committee, and then she would be able to move that motion again, and there could be a fulsome debate with regards to that at a later committee meeting period of time, or at some later meeting. And maybe what I'll do is ask the analysts to at least get us preliminary notes with regards to this situation and how it might pertain to the mandate of our committee. Very good. If there's nothing else, members, Mr. Angus.
Yeah, I just want to clarify because we've had a couple of different suggestions here. I would prefer to actually get the report from the analysts before we're asked to vote on this, because I don't know. It may be an urgent issue. It may not be. We, as Madame Shanahan, who I'm totally in agreement with today, and we're getting along like besties, said we have a lot on our plate. But if we had a report, we could look at it, and then I would ask Madame Goodrow to sort of speak to the report, and then I would prefer to vote on it then, because we would decide whether it is an urgent issue or something that we can put off till later.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that there's agreement. There's a lot of nodding heads with that suggestion, and so we will undertake that in that order. Members, we've gone over time, and so I will move to adjourn the meeting. Meeting adjourned.